Victoria Sterling thought she was losing her mind. The missing car keys that appeared in the refrigerator. The dinner party where she accused guests of moving her jewelry. The nights she swore someone was watching her sleep. Her billionaire husband Marcus insisted these were episodes, signs of a mental breakdown that required immediate treatment. But when Victoria discovered commitment papers with her forged signature, she realized the truth was far more terrifying than madness. She wasn't losing her mind. Someone was stealing it, piece by piece, symptom by symptom, until she questioned everything she knew about reality itself. Pine Ridge Psychiatric Hospital was supposed to be her salvation. Instead, it became her prison. But Victoria had one advantage Marcus never counted on. Her law school roommate, Rachel Montgomery, now worked there as a psychiatrist, and Rachel had been tracking a disturbing pattern. Wealthy women, convenient mental breakdowns, husbands who benefited from their wives' sudden incompetence. What Victoria uncovered wasn't just personal betrayal, it was systematic murder disguised as medical care, a network of corruption that had claimed victims for decades, and she was next on the list. This is the story of how a woman who was supposed to disappear forever became the weapon that destroyed the system trying to erase her. How pharmaceutical torture became the evidence that saved other lives. How a psychiatric patient became a federal prosecutor in her own case. But first, she had to survive long enough to fight back. The pen scratched against expensive paper. Victoria's signature. But she'd never signed anything. Victoria Sterling stood frozen in Marcus's home office, her bare feet cold against the marble floor. The commitment papers trembled in her left hand, while her right gripped a Waterford crystal tumbler half filled with wine. The burgundy liquid caught the late afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting crimson shadows across the legal documents that would steal her freedom. 20 years of marriage, and it had come to this. "You're not well, darling." Marcus's voice came from behind her, smooth as aged whiskey but with an undertone she'd never noticed before. Something calculating, something cruel. "The episodes are getting worse." Episodes, he'd been calling her perfectly rational reactions, episodes for months now. The missing prescriptions she swore she'd never taken. The appointments with doctors she'd never met. Though Marcus insisted she had, the whispered phone calls that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms. The way household staff avoided her eyes as if they knew something she didn't. Victoria's mind raced through recent incidents that Marcus had cataloged with disturbing precision. The dinner party 3 weeks ago, where she'd accused their guests of moving her jewelry box from the dresser to the nightstand. She'd been certain she'd left it in its usual spot, but there it was, gleaming silver against the dark wood, exactly where Marcus said she'd placed it the night before. The morning 2 weeks ago when she'd found her car keys in the refrigerator, nestled between the organic milk and imported cheese. She had no memory of putting them there, but Marcus had found them with the satisfied air of a man proving a point. The night last week when she'd sworn someone was standing in their bedroom doorway at 3 in the morning, a dark silhouette that vanished when she sat up in bed. Marcus had been sleeping peacefully beside her, and when she'd shaken him awake, he'd looked at her with such gentle concern that she'd almost believed she was losing her mind. Almost. "I'm not signing myself into Pine Ridge." Her voice came out steadier than her hands, which continued to shake as she held the papers. The letterhead was embossed, official, expensive. The kind of stationery that announced its credibility through thread count and watermarks. "You already have." Marcus moved closer, his cologne mixing with something else. Something chemical and medicinal that made her stomach turn. "Dr. Hayes confirmed your bed is ready. The transport team arrives in an hour." Victoria's phone buzzed against her palm, where she'd been clutching it unconsciously. She checked it once. Lock screen showed no messages, no missed calls, no evidence that anyone in the world cared enough to reach out to her. She unlocked it compulsively, scrolling through empty notifications. Nothing. She locked it again, then immediately unlocked it, driven by the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had noticed she was disappearing from the world one piece at a time. The compulsive phone checking had started months ago, around the same time the episodes began. Back when she still had friends who called, colleagues who remembered her birthday, a world that extended beyond the marble walls of Marcus's mansion. Now her contact list felt like a graveyard of relationships that had somehow withered and died without her noticing. But one name surfaced in her mind like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Rachel Montgomery, her law school roommate, the brilliant woman who'd chosen psychiatry over corporate law, who used to say that the mind was the final frontier of justice. Rachel worked at Pine Ridge now. Victoria had seen her name mentioned in some medical journal article that had arrived with Marcus's mail months ago. Victoria's internal monologue shifted from panic to something sharper, more focused. I'm not crazy. These papers prove he's been planning this for months. Look at the dates, the scheduling, the detailed medical history I never gave anyone. The real question is why now? She studied the commitment date with a lawyer's eye for detail. Tomorrow. The same day as Marcus's biggest merger, the acquisition that would make him one of the wealthiest men in America. The deal that required spousal consent for the massive asset transfers involved. The merger she'd refused to approve because something about the numbers didn't add up. This is about the Hartwell Industries deal, she said aloud, her voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. You need my signature on those transfer documents, but I won't give it to you, so you're having me declared incompetent instead. Marcus's expression flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression that might have been surprise or might have been admiration. Then his face resumed its mask of concerned husband dealing with an unwell wife. Victoria, darling, you're being paranoid again. This is exactly the kind of delusional thinking Dr. Hayes warned me about. You're seeing conspiracies where there's only love and concern. But Victoria's legal mind was clicking into gear now, analyzing the documents with 20 years of corporate law experience. The psychiatric evaluation was dated 3 days ago, but she'd been nowhere near a doctor's office 3 days ago. She'd been having lunch with Hannah Price, her former colleague from Morrison, Klein & Associates, though Hannah had seemed oddly distant during their conversation, checking her phone frequently and cutting their meeting short. The medical history section detailed symptoms she'd never experienced and medications she'd never taken. Paranoid delusions, check. Violent outbursts, check. Substance abuse, check. A comprehensive portrait of mental illness painted by someone who'd never met her, based on information provided by her loving husband. These documents are fraudulent, Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once wielded in boardrooms across Manhattan. The dates don't align, the medical history is fabricated, and my signature. She held the paper closer to the light, studying the flowing script that looked almost exactly like her own handwriting. Almost, but not quite. The V in Victoria was too rounded, the tail on the G in Sterling too short. Someone had practiced her signature, but not perfectly. Marcus's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with satisfaction. The transport team is early. Victoria, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. 2 men in white uniforms entered the office without knocking, as if they'd been waiting in the hallway for their cue. They moved with professional efficiency, the kind that comes from years of handling resistant patients. The taller one carried a leather medical bag, while the shorter one held what looked like restraints, though he kept them partially hidden behind his back. Mrs. Sterling? The tall one's voice was gentle but firm. I'm Jake, and this is Tom. We're here to help transport you to Pine Ridge for your treatment. I haven't agreed to any treatment, Victoria said, backing toward the window. The drop to the garden below was too far to survive, but the instinct to run was overwhelming. Ma'am, according to our paperwork, you've been involuntarily committed by your husband as your legal guardian. The commitment order is signed by Judge Morrison and Dr. Hayes. We're just here to ensure you get to the facility safely. Judge Morrison, Victoria knew that name. He'd been Marcus's fraternity brother at Harvard, a connection that had proved useful in various business dealings over the years. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. What about my rights? Victoria demanded. I'm entitled to legal representation, to challenge this commitment, to... You'll have access to all of that at the facility, Jake interrupted, moving closer with the kind of careful precision used to approach dangerous animals. Right now, we just need to get you somewhere safe where you can receive proper care. Victoria allowed herself to be led away, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead. Law school had taught her that sometimes you have to lose the battle to position yourself for the war. If Marcus wanted her at Pine Ridge, then Pine Ridge was where she'd mount her defense. As they walked through the mansion's grand foyer, Victoria caught sight of herself in the massive mirror that dominated the entrance hall. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman in crisis. Her dark hair, usually styled in a perfect corporate bob, hung loose and unkempt. Her designer clothes were wrinkled from a sleepless night spent pacing the house. Her eyes, which had once commanded respect in corporate boardrooms, now held the desperate quality of someone whose world was collapsing. But there was something else in her reflection, something Marcus had failed to destroy completely. The sharp intelligence that had gotten her through law school, through 15 years at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms, through deals worth billions of dollars. He'd tried to break her spirit, but he'd only sharpened her resolve. The ambulance doors closed with a metallic clang that echoed like a prison gate. Victoria watched through the rear window as Marcus's mansion, all Gothic towers and manicured gardens that had once felt like a fairy tale, shrank into the distance. The fortress that had become her prison was finally behind her, even if she was heading toward another one. The ride to Pine Ridge took 47 minutes through Manhattan traffic. Victoria counted every minute, using the time to organize her thoughts and plan her strategy. She'd always been methodical in her approach to legal problems, breaking complex issues down into manageable components. This situation was no different. Component 1. Marcus needed her declared incompetent to proceed with the Hartwell merger. Component 2. He'd created a false medical history to support the commitment. Component 3. He'd corrupted the legal process through his connections. Component 4. She was now trapped in a system designed to validate his narrative. But Component 5 was Rachel. Victoria clung to that hope as the ambulance pulled through the gates of Pine Ridge Psychiatric Hospital. The facility looked exactly like what it was, a place where the wealthy sent their inconvenient problems to be managed discreetly. The main building was a converted 19th century mansion, all red brick and ivy-covered walls that spoke of old money and older secrets. The grounds were perfectly maintained with walking paths that meandered through gardens designed to soothe troubled minds, or to prevent escapes, depending on your perspective. As they pulled up to the main entrance, Victoria noticed the subtle signs that marked this as an institution rather than a retreat. The windows were reinforced with wire mesh disguised as decorative metalwork. The gardens were enclosed by walls topped with scrolling ironwork that looked elegant until you noticed the subtle barbs worked into the design. The front door was heavy oak with brass fittings, beautiful and completely secure. "Here we are, Mrs. Sterling," Jake said as the ambulance stopped. "Welcome to Pine Ridge." Victoria stepped out into the evening air, breathing deeply of freedom one last time before walking through doors that might not open again from the inside. But she walked with purpose, her spine straight and her chin up, carrying herself like the lawyer she'd once been, rather than the patient she was supposed to be. Marcus had made his opening move in this deadly game. Now it was her turn. Pine Ridge Psychiatric Hospital smelled like industrial disinfectant layered over something older and more disturbing. Beneath the harsh chemical cleanliness lurked the scent of broken dreams and abandoned hopes, as if despair itself had seeped into the walls over decades of housing the inconvenient and the discarded. Victoria sat in the intake room, her wrists bearing angry red marks from the restraints she'd fought against during the ambulance ride. The fight had been instinctual, a lawyer's rebellion against illegal confinement, but it had only served to validate the narrative Marcus had constructed. Violent outbursts, the intake form would note, resistant to treatment, danger to herself and others. "Mrs. Sterling, Mom." The administrator's voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone who'd delivered bad news to families for decades. He was a thin man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that didn't quite mask the calculation behind them. "I'm Dr. Hayes. We're going to take excellent care of you here." Dr. William Hayes. Victoria recognized the name from Marcus's business correspondence. He'd been on the guest list for several charity galas they'd attended, always seated at tables near major donors. Another piece of Marcus's carefully constructed web. The intake questions felt choreographed, as if everyone in the room was reading from a script she'd never been allowed to see. Had she been experiencing paranoid thoughts lately? Mood swings that seemed disproportionate to their triggers? Memory problems, particularly around important events or conversations? Each question was perfectly aligned with the symptoms described in the fabricated medical history Marcus had provided. It was elegant in its simplicity, a closed loop of evidence that reinforced itself at every turn. Victoria's legal mind cataloged every irregularity with methodical precision. The pre-signed admission forms that should have required her signature, the bed assignment that had been scheduled weeks in advance, as if her breakdown had been penciled into someone's calendar. The staff's easy familiarity with her case history, despite this being her first time at the facility. Most telling of all was the medication cart wheeled in by a nurse who introduced herself as Patricia Coleman. The woman's cheerful demeanor couldn't quite hide the wariness in her eyes, as if she'd been briefed on Victoria's potential for violence. I trusted the wrong person, Victoria thought, the realization settling over her like a burial shroud. But that doesn't make me crazy. The nurse approached with a small paper cup containing 2 pills, one white and one blue. These will help with the anxiety and paranoia, Patricia said, her tone suggesting that refusal wasn't really an option. Dr. Hayes wants to get you stabilized as quickly as possible. What are they? Victoria's lawyer training kicked in automatically. Never sign anything you haven't read. Never take anything you haven't identified. Never trust anyone who won't answer direct questions. Doctor's orders, Patricia replied with practiced evasion. It was a non-answer wrapped in medical authority, the kind of bureaucratic deflection Victoria had encountered countless times in corporate negotiations. Red flag. Victoria palmed the pills with a sleight of hand she'd learned during a college summer spent working as a magician's assistant, a skill she'd never imagined would become useful in her adult life. She made a show of tilting her head back and swallowing, then asked for water to wash them down. Patricia smiled approvingly and made a note on her chart. Patient compliant with medication regimen. Another lie added to the growing collection. Victoria's room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking gardens that stretched to the facility's outer walls. The view was carefully designed to be soothing, flowering trees, meandering paths, a small pond with a fountain that caught the afternoon light. Beautiful, serene, and completely secured. It was a luxury prison for people whose families could afford to make their problems disappear with elegance and discretion. The room itself was appointments that walked the line between hospital and hotel. A single bed with clean white linens, a desk positioned near the window to catch natural light, a comfortable armchair upholstered in calming blue fabric. Everything was beautiful and nothing was dangerous. No sharp corners, no removable hardware, no objects that could be fashioned into weapons or tools of escape. Victoria found herself arranging and rearranging the few personal items Marcus had packed for her. A silk scarf in deep burgundy that had been a gift from her mother. Her law school class ring, which she still wore on her right hand like a talisman. A framed photograph of her parents taken shortly before their deaths in a car accident 5 years ago. The repetitive action of moving these objects from dresser to nightstand to windowsill and back again provided an illusion of control in an environment designed to strip away every trace of personal agency. It was a small ritual, meaningless to an observer, but crucial to her psychological survival. That evening, as the dinner hour approached and the hallways filled with the soft sounds of institutional routine, Dr. Rachel Montgomery appeared in Victoria's doorway. "Hello, Vicky." The old nickname hit Victoria like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of 20 years and the memory of a friendship that had once been the most important relationship in her life. Victoria had been Victoria to everyone else, but to Rachel, she'd always been Vicky, the girl who'd stayed up all night cramming for contracts class, who'd lived on coffee and determination, who'd believed she could change the world through the precise application of legal principles. Rachel hadn't changed much in the 2 decades since graduation. She still wore wire-rimmed glasses that made her look younger than her 41 years, still carried herself with the no-nonsense posture of someone who'd earned respect through competence rather than connections. But there was something new there too: authority, confidence, the quiet power that came from years of helping people navigate the darkest corners of their minds. "You're my psychiatrist," Victoria said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of recognition, pieces falling into place with the satisfying click of a complex puzzle solving itself. "I requested to be assigned to your case when I saw your name on the admission roster," Rachel said, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed peeled back 20 years like pages in a photo album, each memory sharp and painful in its clarity. Rachel had followed Victoria's career from a distance, tracking her rise through the ranks at Morrison, Klein& and Associates, her marriage to Marcus Sterling, her gradual transformation from rising legal star to society wife, and then more recently, her complete disappearance from professional and social circles. "You were the strongest person I knew in law school," Rachel said quietly, settling into the room's single chair while Victoria perched on the edge of the bed. "The woman who argued down Professor Hendricks when he tried to mansplain tort law to a class full of future lawyers. The woman who organized the study group that got half our graduating class through the bar exam. What happened to her?" Victoria wanted to explain, but the words tangled in her throat like barbed wire. "How do you describe the slow erosion of self that happens when someone systematically dismantles your reality piece by piece? The way Marcus had gradually isolated her from friends, convincing her that they were jealous of her success, that their concerns about his controlling behavior were rooted in envy rather than genuine care. The way he'd encouraged her to leave the law firm after their marriage, suggesting that her career stress was affecting her health, that she deserved to enjoy the fruits of their combined success, rather than working herself into an early grave. The way he'd made her question every instinct, doubt every memory, until she'd become a ghost haunting her own life. "I don't know," Victoria finally said, and the admission felt like swallowing ground glass. "It happened so gradually I didn't notice until it was too late." Rachel nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen this pattern countless times in her professional practice. "Coercive control," she said. "It's insidious because it masquerades as love and protection. By the time victims realize what's happening, their support systems have been systematically destroyed." They sat in silence for several minutes, processing their reunion and the circumstances that had brought them together after so many years. The old friendship settled around them like a familiar coat, worn and comfortable despite the time and distance that had separated them. "Rachel," Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I'm in serious trouble." "I know you are," Rachel replied. "That's why we need to be very careful about how we handle this. Vicky, I've been tracking suspicious admissions at Pine Ridge for the past 6 months. Wealthy women whose husbands suddenly develop concerns about their mental health at very convenient times." Victoria's pulse quickened, hope flaring in her chest like a match struck in darkness. "How many?" "More than you'd want to know, and the pattern is always the same. Financial pressures, business deals requiring spousal consent, inheritance disputes, divorce proceedings where the distribution of assets would be problematic. The women arrive with detailed psychiatric histories that paint them as unstable, dangerous, incompetent to manage their own affairs." "But you don't believe the histories are real." "I believe they're very carefully constructed fiction. The question is proving it, and more importantly, preventing these women from disappearing into the system permanently." Rachel reached into her jacket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind doctors used to jot down patient observations. But when she opened it, Victoria saw that it contained something else entirely. Names, dates, financial records, a carefully documented pattern of abuse disguised as medical treatment. "Margaret Thornfield," Rachel read, "committed for bipolar disorder 6 weeks before her husband's company went public. She's an economist with a PhD from Wharton, but her medical records suggest she's been hallucinating about non-existent financial irregularities in her husband's business." Patricia Whitmore, admitted for paranoid personality disorder 2 days before she was scheduled to testify in a divorce proceeding that would have cost her husband $50 million. Jennifer Crawford, brought in for acute anxiety disorder the day before she was supposed to inherit controlling interest in her father's media empire. Each name was another woman whose life had been stolen, another family destroyed by men who viewed their wives as obstacles to be removed rather than partners to be cherished. Victoria felt sick thinking about how many others might be trapped in similar situations, their voices silenced by the very system that was supposed to protect them. What about their families, their friends? Doesn't anyone question these sudden breakdowns? "That's the beauty of the system," Rachel said bitterly. "These women are isolated long before they're committed. Their support networks are systematically destroyed through campaigns of manipulation and character assassination. By the time they arrive here, they've been effectively erased from their own lives. No one is looking for them because no one remembers they existed as independent people." The truth of that statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had called just to check on her? When was the last time she'd had a conversation that wasn't filtered through Marcus's presence or influenced by his opinions? She'd become invisible in her own life, a ghost haunting the margins of her husband's world. But you remember, Victoria said. I remember the woman who was going to revolutionize corporate law by making it more ethical. I remember someone who believed that justice wasn't just about winning, but about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. That woman wouldn't have disappeared without a fight. Victoria felt something stir in her chest, an ember of the person she'd once been flickering back to life. She didn't disappear, she said quietly. She was buried, but she's still here. Rachel smiled for the first time since entering the room, and Victoria saw in her face the echo of the girl who'd shared midnight pizza and constitutional law study sessions, who'd believed they could change the world through the precise application of intelligence and determination. Then let's dig her up, Rachel said, because we're going to need her if we want to survive what's coming next. Rachel's office became a war room in the early morning hours before the hospital's official day began. She'd arranged to meet Victoria under the pretense of an emergency psychiatric evaluation, but instead of exploring her patient's mental state, she spread files across her desk like a general planning a military campaign. The patterns were immediately recognizable to Victoria's legal mind, as clear and damning as any fraudulent contract she'd ever reviewed. Each file told the same story with minor variations, like a template for destruction filled in with different names and details. Margaret Thornfield, Rachel said, opening the first file. Age 42, MBA from Wharton, 15 years as a senior economist at Crawford Financial. Married to David Thornfield, CEO of Thornfield Industries. Committed to Pine Ridge 6 weeks before Thornfield Industries' initial public offering. Diagnosis, bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Victoria studied Margaret's photograph, a professional headshot that showed a confident woman with intelligent eyes and a determined smile. The kind of woman who'd built her career on analyzing complex financial data and making million-dollar recommendations based on mathematical models and market trends. What were her supposed symptoms? According to her husband, she'd become obsessed with imaginary financial irregularities in his company's books. She was making wild accusations about embezzlement, claiming that the IPO prospectus contained fraudulent information. She'd started calling reporters and regulatory agencies with her delusions about corporate misconduct. Let me guess, Victoria said dryly. The SEC investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing. The investigation was dropped after Mrs. Thornfield was hospitalized and deemed an unreliable witness due to her mental state. Thornfield Industries went public on schedule and raised $2 billion. David Thornfield became one of the wealthiest men in America. Victoria's hands clenched into fists as the scope of the fraud became clear. She wasn't delusional. She found evidence of actual financial crimes and was silenced before she could expose them. That's what I believe, but Margaret's been here for 4 months now, heavily medicated, declared incompetent to manage her own affairs. Her husband has power of attorney over her financial assets, including the stock options that would have made her independently wealthy after the IPO. Rachel opened the second file. Patricia Whitmore, federal prosecutor, 15 years with the Southern District of New York, specialized in organized crime cases. Married to Vincent Whitmore, owner of several construction companies with rumored mob connections. Committed 2 days before she was scheduled to testify in their divorce proceedings. Patricia's photograph showed a woman in her late 30s with prematurely gray hair and laugh lines around her eyes. The kind of prosecutor who'd spent years putting dangerous criminals behind bars. Victoria could imagine her in a courtroom, methodically building cases that sent mobsters to prison for life. Her diagnosis? Paranoid personality disorder. According to Vincent, she'd become convinced that his business associates were planning to kill her. She'd started carrying a gun, installing security systems, changing the locks on their house every few weeks. Classic paranoid behavior that made her unsuitable to continue in her prosecutorial role. Except she was probably right to be paranoid, Victoria observed. If she'd been investigating organized crime for 15 years, she'd know what real threats looked like. Vincent's construction company landed 3 major municipal contracts within 6 months of Patricia's commitment. Projects worth over $200 million in neighborhoods where his wife had been building racketeering cases. The divorce proceedings were suspended indefinitely due to her mental incapacity. Victoria felt her anger crystallizing into something colder and more precise than rage. This wasn't just personal betrayal, it was systematic destruction of women whose only crime was being inconveniently competent. Show me the third one. Rachel opened Jennifer Crawford's file. Age 38, PhD in media studies from Columbia, worked as a documentary filmmaker specializing in corporate malfeasance. She was scheduled to inherit controlling interest in Crawford Media Holdings when she turned 40 next month. Her stepfather, Richard Crawford, committed her for acute anxiety disorder. Jennifer's photograph showed a woman with short dark hair and intense eyes, someone who'd spent her career exposing corruption through carefully researched documentaries. Victoria recognized the type, the investigative journalist who followed money trails and asked uncomfortable questions until powerful people were forced to provide uncomfortable answers. Let me guess her symptoms. Obsessive behavior, including compulsive research into her stepfather's business dealings. She'd allegedly been making paranoid accusations about financial improprieties, claiming that Richard had been embezzling from her father's estate for years. She'd started filming everyone around her, convinced that they were conspiring against her. She was investigating him. Almost certainly. Jennifer had spent 10 years making documentaries about corporate fraud. She'd know how to research financial records, follow paper trails, build cases against white-collar criminals. If she'd turned those skills on her stepfather's management of her inheritance, Victoria stared at the three photographs, seeing her own story reflected in their faces. Competent women who discovered inconvenient truths, who'd posed threats to powerful men, who'd been silenced through the medical system rather than through violence or legal challenges that might have attracted unwanted attention. This is systematic fraud, Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once wielded in corporate boardrooms. A coordinated effort to neutralize threats using psychiatric commitment as a weapon. And Marcus Sterling has been perfecting the system, Rachel said, pulling up financial records on her computer. He's been consulting with Pine Ridge for 3 years, donating millions to expand the facility and develop new treatment protocols. Dr. Hayes owes his position as administrator to your husband's patronage. The computer screen showed a web of financial connections that made Victoria's stomach turn. Marcus's charitable foundation had donated $12 million to Pine Ridge over the past 3 years, funding new wings, upgrading medical equipment, and endowing research chairs. In return, the hospital had developed specialized programs for treating wealthy patients with complex psychological presentations. Translation, they'd become experts at making inconvenient women disappear. He didn't just betray me, Victoria realized. He created an entire pipeline for wealthy men to dispose of their wives. The scope of Marcus's manipulation became clear as Rachel showed her the consulting contracts, the research partnerships, the carefully constructed legal frameworks that allowed Pine Ridge to hold patients indefinitely under the guise of protecting them from their own mental illness. It was elegant in its cruelty, using the language of medical care to justify systematic abuse. Victoria's anger transformed into something more dangerous: strategic planning. We need evidence that will stand up in court, documentation, financial records, witness testimony, something that proves this isn't legitimate medical treatment, but criminal conspiracy. That's where things get complicated, Rachel admitted. I'm bound by patient confidentiality. I can't share medical records or discuss other patients' cases without their consent. And most of these women have been so heavily medicated and psychologically manipulated that getting coherent testimony from them would be nearly impossible. Victoria understood the legal constraints, but she also understood something else. You're not bound by confidentiality when it comes to criminal activity. If you have evidence that patients are being held illegally or that medical records are being falsified, you have a duty to report it. Rachel smiled grimly. Spoken like a lawyer. The problem is proving criminal activity when the system is designed to make everything look legitimate. Every commitment order has been signed by a judge. Every diagnosis confirmed by licensed psychiatrists. Every treatment plan approved by medical boards. But something made you suspicious in the first place. What was it? Rachel was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she pulled out another file, this one marked with red tape indicating restricted access. Hair samples from your brush, she said quietly. Blood work from your admission. Lab results that tell a very different story than your supposed mental illness. The test results made Victoria's blood run cold. Traces of hallucinogenic compounds that would cause paranoia and memory problems. Pharmaceutical cocktails designed to create the exact symptoms described in her fabricated medical history. Chemical evidence of systematic poisoning disguised as mental health treatment. He's been drugging me for months, Victoria said, her voice deadly quiet, making me question my own sanity while creating evidence to support his narrative. The scope of Marcus's manipulation became clear as more pieces fell into place. The missing keys that appeared in strange locations weren't evidence of her declining mental state. They were planted there while she was unconscious from whatever he'd been putting in her food or drink. The episodes at social functions weren't paranoid delusions, but rational responses to real threats that had been chemically amplified to appear pathological. I wasn't losing my mind, Victoria said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Someone was stealing it from me piece by piece. Rachel nodded grimly. The question is, how many other women are experiencing similar poisoning? How many of these supposed mental breakdowns are actually the result of deliberate chemical manipulation? Victoria found herself unconsciously checking her pulse, a nervous habit from law school when she'd been preparing for major cases. Her heart was racing, but not from anxiety, from anger, from determination, from the electric thrill of a complex legal problem finally beginning to make sense. Some instincts never fade, even after years of suppression. We need to test the other patients, Victoria said. Blood work, hair samples, anything that might show evidence of non-prescribed drugs in their systems. I've been trying, but it's difficult to order tests without medical justification. And even if I find evidence of poisoning, proving that it was done deliberately rather than accidental contamination or self-administered drugs would be nearly impossible. Victoria began building her case with the methodical precision that had made her one of Manhattan's most effective corporate attorneys. Every conversation with staff would be analyzed for inconsistencies. Every procedure would be questioned and documented. Every medication would be refused when possible, breaking the cycle of chemical manipulation that kept patients compliant and confused. The memories were flooding back now. 20 years of legal training and professional experience that Marcus had tried to bury under layers of psychological manipulation. She remembered the late nights in law school, studying with Rachel until the library closed, and then continuing in their shared apartment. The way they challenged each other, pushed each other, refused to accept easy answers when complex problems demanded rigorous analysis. Rachel had chosen psychiatry because she believed the mind was the final frontier of justice, the place where truth and healing intersected in ways that could transform lives. Victoria had chosen corporate law because she believed that business could be a force for good when governed by ethical principles and legal frameworks that protected the vulnerable from exploitation. They'd both been naive about how easily those noble intentions could be corrupted by people with enough money and power to remake reality according to their own desires. There's something else, Rachel said, pulling up security footage on her computer. I've been reviewing the hospital's surveillance system, and I found something interesting. The video showed Marcus entering Pine Ridge through a private entrance that most visitors never saw, using a key card that gave him access to restricted areas. He moved through the corridors with easy familiarity, stopping to chat with staff members who greeted him like a colleague rather than a visitor. In Dr. Hayes's office, the two men reviewed files together, pointing at documents and nodding in agreement like conspirators planning their next move. He's more involved in daily operations than any spouse should be, Rachel observed. This isn't a man visiting his sick wife. This is a business partner checking on his investment. Victoria watched her billionaire husband navigate the hospital's corridors like he owned them, which she realized with growing horror he essentially did. The donations, the consulting contracts, the research partnerships. Marcus hadn't just found a place to dispose of his inconvenient wife. He'd created that place, molded it to serve his purposes, turned what should have been a healing institution into a weapon against women who pose threats to men like him. We're going to need help, Victoria said finally. This is too big for just the two of us to handle. We need allies, evidence, legal resources. We need to build a case that will not only free the women who are trapped here, but prevent this from happening to others. Rachel nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. The question is who to trust when we don't know how deep this corruption goes. Victoria smiled for the first time since her commitment, feeling more like herself than she had in months. Then we start with what we know and work outward. We document everything, collect evidence, build relationships with people who can help us expose this system. And we do it carefully, because if Marcus realizes what we're planning, he'll find ways to make us disappear permanently, Rachel finished. Exactly. But here's what he doesn't understand. He didn't just commit his wife to a psychiatric hospital, he committed a lawyer, and lawyers know how to fight back. Rachel introduced Victoria to Pine Ridge's hidden reality through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters that felt like scenes from a spy novel. Beneath the therapeutic facade of morning meditation sessions and art therapy workshops ran a network of corruption so sophisticated that it took Victoria's breath away. The first crack in the hospital's carefully maintained veneer came during group therapy on Victoria's third day. Dr. Hayes led the session with practiced compassion, guiding 8 women through discussions of their progress and treatment goals. To an outside observer, it would have appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be, a supportive environment where troubled women could work through their psychological challenges with professional guidance. But Victoria's legal training had taught her to listen for what wasn't being said as much as what was, and the silences in that room spoke volumes. Margaret Thornfield sat in the corner chair, her economist mind clearly still sharp despite the heavy medication regimen that left her movements sluggish and her speech slightly slurred. When Dr. Hayes asked about her obsessive thoughts regarding financial irregularities, Margaret's eyes flashed with a combination of fury and helplessness that Victoria recognized from her own mirror. "The numbers don't lie," Margaret said quietly, her words carefully chosen. 2 plus 2 still equals 4, even when people insist it equals 5. Dr. Hayes made a note on his pad. "We've discussed your tendency to see patterns that aren't there, Margaret. These mathematical delusions are a common symptom of your condition." Mathematical delusions. Victoria wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. A woman with a PhD in economics from Wharton was being told that her ability to analyze financial data was a symptom of mental illness. It was gaslighting elevated to an art form. Patricia Whitmore sat across the circle, her federal prosecutor's bearing still evident despite months of institutional life. When the conversation turned to her paranoid fantasies about organized crime, Patricia's response was measured and professional. "Experience teaches us to recognize genuine threats," she said. "When you've spent 15 years prosecuting dangerous criminals, you develop instincts about who poses risks and who doesn't. Those instincts don't become delusions just because they're inconvenient." "But Patricia," Dr. Hayes said with patronizing gentleness, "you were carrying weapons, changing your locks weekly, seeing threats that weren't there. That's not professional instinct, that's paranoid behavior." Victoria caught Patricia's eye and saw a flash of recognition pass between them. 2 professional women who understood that their competence was being reframed as pathology, their expertise dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. The third woman who caught Victoria's attention was Jennifer Crawford, the documentary filmmaker who'd been committed just before inheriting her father's media empire. Jennifer listened to the group discussions with the focused intensity of someone gathering material for a story, her eyes moving constantly between speakers, as if she were still filming in her mind. "Jennifer, you've been very quiet today," Dr. Hayes observed. "How are you feeling about your progress?" "I'm learning a great deal about institutional structures," Jennifer replied carefully. "About how power operates in closed systems and how narratives are constructed to serve particular interests." Another note on Dr. Hayes's pad. "Patient continues to exhibit obsessive thinking patterns and paranoid ideation regarding institutional authority." Victoria began to understand that she was witnessing a form of warfare disguised as medical treatment. Every session was designed to break down the women's confidence in their own perceptions, to convince them that their professional skills and life experiences were actually symptoms of mental illness. It was systematic psychological torture administered with clinical precision. The real revelation came during recreational time, when patients were encouraged to socialize in the common areas under minimal supervision. Victoria had been reading in the library when Margaret approached her with a chess set, suggesting a game as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But as they played, Margaret spoke in whispers that carried the urgency of state secrets. "The financial records they claim don't exist," Margaret said, moving her knight to protect her queen. "I photographed them before David had me committed. The evidence is hidden in my safety deposit box at Manhattan Trust." Victoria moved her own piece carefully, understanding that this conversation was more dangerous than any legal negotiation she'd ever conducted. "Can anyone access that box?" "Only with my signature, and David doesn't know it exists. I opened it 2 years ago when I first started noticing irregularities in the company books." Margaret's next move put Victoria's king in check, but her real message was in her eyes. "You're not the only one who came prepared for war." Patricia joined them 20 minutes later, ostensibly interested in the chess game, but actually contributing her own piece of the puzzle. "The construction contracts Vincent won after my commitment," she said, pretending to study the board. "They're connected to the same shell companies that have been laundering money for the Torino family for years. The evidence is in federal case files that are still sealed pending ongoing investigations." "Can those files be accessed?" Victoria asked. "Not legally, but I have contacts in the Bureau who know something's wrong. Special Agent Sarah Walsh has been asking questions about my commitment, trying to understand why a federal prosecutor would suddenly develop paranoid delusions about cases she'd been building for months." Victoria felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Detective Sarah Walsh, an ally in law enforcement who might be willing to look past the official narrative and investigate what was really happening at Pine Ridge. Jennifer's contribution came during art therapy the following day, when patients were encouraged to express their feelings through painting and sculpture. Victoria was creating an abstract piece that looked like random color splashes to casual observers, but actually contained a coded legal brief outlining the evidence of systematic fraud when Jennifer approached with her own canvas. "Documentary filmmaking teaches you to look for visual evidence," Jennifer said quietly, adding brushstrokes that seemed random but created specific patterns when viewed from the right angle. "I've been documenting everything since I arrived. Staff schedules, visitor logs, medication distribution patterns, financial transactions. The evidence is hidden throughout my room in ways that look like random personal items, but actually contain comprehensive records." "How comprehensive?" Victoria asked. "Enough to build a federal case for conspiracy, fraud, false imprisonment, and possibly murder. 2 patients have died here in the past year from complications that occurred right after their families gained control of their estates." Murder. The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence, transforming their situation from civil rights violation to criminal conspiracy of the highest order. That evening, Rachel arranged an emergency consultation under the pretense of adjusting Victoria's medication regimen. But instead of discussing psychiatric treatment, she introduced Victoria to the most dangerous ally of all, Detective Sarah Walsh. Sarah was a compact woman in her late 30s, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She wore civilian clothes and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to asking hard questions and demanding honest answers. Patricia Whitmore was building the biggest organized crime case in 20 years when she was committed, Sarah explained, settling into the chair across from Victoria, like they were having a normal conversation rather than planning to expose a criminal conspiracy. RICO violations, money laundering, murder for hire, the works. She was 3 weeks away from presenting her case to a grand jury when her husband had her declared mentally incompetent. "Some. Your husband's pattern is escalation," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years studying criminal behavior. "Financial control through isolation and manipulation, then social control through character assassination, then institutional control through fraudulent commitment. The final step." She didn't need to finish. Victoria understood the progression, from disappearance to death, with enough time in between to transfer assets and establish legal alibis. "How many other women are we talking about?" Victoria asked. "That we know of? At least a dozen over the past 3 years, spread across multiple facilities, but all connected to Pine Ridge through Marcus's consulting network. But if this system has been operating for longer than we think, or if it extends beyond psychiatric hospitals." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its effectiveness. Marcus hadn't just found a way to dispose of his inconvenient wife. He'd created a business model for wealthy men who needed their own inconvenient women to disappear. Hannah Price made contact the following day during visiting hours, arriving with flowers and the kind of bright smile that casual observers would interpret as a friend bringing comfort to a sick woman. But the documents hidden in the flower arrangement told a different story entirely. Property transfers, power of attorney documents, business filings, Hannah whispered as they arranged the flowers in Victoria's room. Marcus has been systematically draining your accounts for months, transferring assets to offshore entities that you can't touch even if you regain legal competency. The financial evidence revealed Marcus's true situation. His tech empire was leveraged beyond stability, dependent on loans secured by assets that belonged to Victoria's family trust. He needed that $300 million trust fund not just to complete the Hartwell merger, but to prevent the complete collapse of his business empire. Victoria's fury crystallized into strategic planning as she reviewed the documents. This wasn't just personal betrayal or even criminal fraud. It was attempted financial murder disguised as mental health care. Marcus was literally trying to steal her entire identity, reducing her from an independent woman with her own fortune to a psychiatric patient whose assets could be managed by her loving husband. The scope of his manipulation became clear as more evidence accumulated. The missing prescriptions weren't evidence of her declining mental state. They were part of a systematic drugging regimen designed to create the exact symptoms described in his fabricated medical history. The appointments with doctors she'd never met had actually happened. But while she was unconscious from whatever pharmaceutical cocktails he'd been administering through her food or drinks, Victoria began documenting everything with the methodical precision that had made her one of Manhattan's most effective corporate attorneys. Staff rotations went into a mental file that she reviewed each night before sleep. Medication schedules were memorized and compared across patients to identify patterns of chemical manipulation. Dr. Hayes's off-books meetings were timed and cataloged, creating a comprehensive picture of the hospital's hidden operations. Her legal training served her well in building an airtight case, but it also revealed the magnitude of the challenge they faced. Every piece of evidence had to be obtained without alerting the conspiracy to their investigation. Every ally had to be vetted carefully to ensure they weren't part of the system they were trying to expose. Every move had to be planned 3 steps ahead, because if Marcus realized what they were planning, he had the resources to make all of them disappear permanently. Late at night, Victoria sat by her window writing detailed notes about her marriage in a journal she'd requested for therapeutic purposes. The process of documenting Marcus's systematic manipulation helped her separate reality from the manufactured narrative he'd constructed. But it also revealed how completely she'd been isolated from any support system that might have helped her recognize what was happening. Thomas Reed's unexpected visit on her 5th day at Pine Ridge felt like the final piece of a complex puzzle clicking into place. The family attorney who'd handled Marcus's business for 15 years arrived with legal documents and the kind of patronizing concern that made Victoria want to commit actual violence. "Victoria, Marcus is deeply concerned about your financial responsibilities," Thomas said, spreading papers across the small table in her room. "Given your current situation, it might be wise to simplify your legal obligations. Sign power of attorney over to Marcus so he can protect your interests while you focus on recovery. Translation: sign over the trust fund so he can prevent bankruptcy and continue his criminal enterprise." Victoria's response was measured and calculating, a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She appeared confused, medicated, vulnerable, exactly the image Marcus needed her to project to justify his legal guardianship. "I just want to get better," she said, injecting the right amount of defeat into her voice while her eyes remained vacant and compliant. "Whatever Marcus thinks is best for me." Victoria found herself instinctively mirroring Thomas's body language, a negotiation technique from law school that she'd used countless times in corporate boardrooms. Lean forward when he leaned forward, nod when he nodded, create the illusion of agreement while gathering intelligence about his real agenda. Even confined in a psychiatric hospital, she was still a lawyer, and lawyers knew how to perform for an audience. Thomas smiled with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd successfully manipulated a mentally incompetent woman. "I'll have the papers drawn up properly. Marcus will be so relieved to know you're being reasonable about this." After he left, Hannah revealed the most damaging evidence yet. Marcus had been forging Victoria's signature for months on dozens of financial documents. The commitment papers weren't his first fraud. They were simply his most ambitious. Bank records showed a systematic pattern of asset transfers that had accelerated dramatically in the weeks before her commitment, as if he'd been preparing for the moment when he could claim legal guardianship over her entire fortune. The pattern was clear now, documented with the kind of precision that would stand up in federal court. Marcus had been systematically stealing Victoria's identity piece by piece, replacing her agency with his control, her voice with his narrative, her reality with his manufactured version of events. But he'd made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to destroy. Victoria Sterling might have been buried under months of psychological manipulation and chemical suppression, but she wasn't dead. And now that she was fully awake, she was ready to fight back with everything she'd learned during 15 years as one of Manhattan's most dangerous corporate attorneys. The war was just beginning. Pine Ridge revealed its hidden population through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters that felt like a resistance network forming in enemy territory. Victoria discovered that beneath the surface of therapeutic routine, a community of remarkable women had been waging quiet warfare against their captors, maintaining their sanity and their sense of self despite systematic attempts to destroy both. The revelation came during her second week, when Margaret Thornfield approached her during recreational time with what appeared to be a casual invitation to join a book club. "We meet in the library every Tuesday evening," Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of casual tone that wouldn't attract staff attention. "We're reading The Feminine Mystique this week, very relevant to our situation." Victoria understood immediately that they weren't discussing Betty Friedan's analysis of suburban housewife malaise. They were talking about the systematic oppression of women whose only crime was being inconveniently competent. The book club met in the hospital library's back corner, surrounded by medical journals and psychiatric textbooks that provided excellent camouflage for their real discussions. Besides Margaret and Victoria, the group included Patricia Whitmore, Jennifer Crawford, and 3 other women whose stories followed the same devastating pattern. "We're not mental patients," Victoria said during their first real meeting, her voice low but carrying the authority she'd once wielded in corporate boardrooms. "We're political prisoners in a war against our own autonomy." The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence, transforming their situation from individual medical cases to collective resistance movement. Margaret nodded grimly, her economist mind clearly cataloging the financial implications of their imprisonment. Patricia leaned forward with the intense focus of a federal prosecutor building a case. Jennifer's eyes gleamed with the investigative instincts that had made her documentaries so effective at exposing corruption. "The question is how we fight back without alerting them to what we're planning," Margaret said. "David thinks he successfully silenced me, but I've been documenting everything since I arrived. Account numbers, transfer records, board meeting minutes, enough evidence to prove his embezzlement and securities fraud." Patricia's contribution was even more dangerous. "The organized crime connections run deeper than anyone realizes. Vincent's construction company is just one tentacle of an operation that includes judicial corruption, police payoffs, and political connections at the highest levels. I have witness testimony and financial records that could bring down an entire crime family. And I have video evidence," Jennifer added quietly, "not just of what's happening here at Pine Ridge, but of the entire network. The consulting agreements, the financial transfers, the coordination between multiple facilities. I've been filming everything with equipment hidden in personal items that look innocent to staff inspections." Victoria felt her legal mind spinning into overdrive as the scope of their collective evidence became clear. They weren't just dealing with individual cases of spousal abuse or financial fraud. They were sitting on documentation that could expose a criminal conspiracy stretching across multiple states and involving dozens of powerful men. "We need to coordinate our effort," Victoria said, falling naturally into the leadership role she'd always assumed in complex legal situations. "Share information, verify each other's evidence, build cases that are stronger together than they would be individually." The challenge was communication in an environment designed to prevent exactly the kind of collaboration they were planning. Every conversation was potentially monitored, Every meeting could be interpreted as evidence of conspiracy thinking. Every document could be confiscated as contraband. But they were all intelligent women who'd built successful careers through creative problem solving. Margaret developed a system of coded communications hidden in chess games and card playing. Patricia used her knowledge of law enforcement procedures to identify surveillance blind spots where they could meet without observation. Jennifer documented everything through seemingly innocent art projects that actually contained detailed evidence logs. Rachel Montgomery became their most crucial ally, though her position as Victoria's treating psychiatrist meant their collaboration had to be extraordinarily careful. During their official therapy sessions, Rachel helped Victoria process the psychological impact of Marcus's systematic manipulation, but she also coordinated communications with Detective Sarah Walsh and provided medical expertise that legitimized their investigation. The blood work doesn't lie, Rachel explained during one of their sessions, her voice professionally clinical, but her eyes burning with controlled fury. The pharmaceutical compounds in your system would have caused every symptom Marcus described in his commitment petition: paranoia, memory problems, emotional instability, poor judgment, all chemically induced to create the appearance of mental illness. The revelation that Victoria had been systematically poisoned transformed her anger from personal fury to strategic determination. This wasn't just betrayal, it was attempted murder disguised as medical care. Marcus hadn't just stolen her freedom, he tried to steal her mind, her identity, her very sense of reality. How many other patients show similar chemical evidence? Victoria asked. I can't discuss other patients specifically due to confidentiality requirements, Rachel said carefully, but I can say that certain pharmaceutical patterns appear to be more common than medical literature would suggest for spontaneous psychiatric episodes. Victoria understood the legal constraints Rachel faced, but she also understood the implications. If multiple patients showed evidence of non-prescribed drugs in their systems, it would prove systematic poisoning rather than individual medical conditions. Detective Sarah Walsh's involvement escalated during Victoria's third week when she arrived at Pine Ridge posing as a federal inspector conducting routine quality assurance reviews. Her actual purpose was far more dangerous: documenting evidence that would support federal charges of conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. The pattern extends beyond Pine Ridge, Sarah explained during a covert meeting in the hospital chapel, her voice barely above a whisper. We've identified similar operations in California, Florida, and Texas. Wealthy women with inconvenient knowledge or assets being systematically silenced through fraudulent psychiatric commitments. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Marcus Sterling wasn't just the architect of Victoria's destruction. He was part of a national network that helped powerful men eliminate threats to their wealth and influence through medical kidnapping. Your husband's consulting contracts show payments from at least 30 different individuals over the past 3 years, Sarah continued. Men facing expensive divorces, inheritance disputes, fraud investigations, or business partnerships where their wives' knowledge posed threats to their continued freedom. Victoria's fury crystallized into something more dangerous than rage: systematic legal warfare. She began actively recruiting other patients, teaching them to recognize gaslighting techniques, to document their treatment, to maintain their sense of reality despite institutional attempts to destroy their confidence in their own perceptions. Trust what you see, she told new arrivals during group therapy sessions that she gradually transformed into covert resistance meetings. Trust what you feel. Trust your professional experience and your life knowledge. They can't take that from you unless you let them. Dr. Hayes began to notice the change in group dynamics, the way discussions that were supposed to break down patients' confidence instead seemed to be building their sense of solidarity and shared purpose. He increased medication dosages and added individual therapy sessions designed to isolate potential leaders from the larger group. But Victoria's legal training had taught her to anticipate such tactics. She and Margaret developed systems for sharing medications covertly, allowing some patients to maintain mental clarity while appearing compliant with treatment regimens. Patricia used her law enforcement experience to identify which staff members were actively complicit versus simply following orders. Jennifer documented everything through artwork that looked therapeutic to casual observers, but actually contained detailed evidence logs. The breakthrough came when Victoria's darkest moment nearly became her actual breaking point. During a forced therapy session, Dr. Hayes attempted to break her psychologically with a combination of pharmaceutical manipulation and systematic gaslighting that came terrifyingly close to succeeding. "You're here because you lost touch with reality," Dr. Hayes insisted, his voice carrying the false compassion of someone who'd perfected the art of psychological torture. "Your husband loves you. He's trying to help you get well. These paranoid fantasies about conspiracy and fraud are symptoms of your mental illness, not evidence of anyone's wrongdoing." For a terrifying moment, Victoria almost believed him. The isolation, the drugs, the constant questioning of her perceptions had created genuine doubt about her own sanity. The systematic destruction of her confidence had brought her to the edge of actual psychological collapse. "I'm losing my mind," she thought desperately. "Maybe Marcus is right. Maybe I really am sick. Maybe everything I remember is distorted by mental illness." The moment passed like a fever breaking when she remembered Margaret's words from their first real conversation. 2 plus 2 still equals 4, even when people insist it equals 5. Mathematical reality, legal precedent, physical evidence, the foundation of objective truth that no amount of psychological manipulation could destroy. Alone in her room after the session, Victoria methodically listed facts she knew to be true, grounding techniques Rachel had taught her years ago during law school when the pressure of finals had threatened to overwhelm them both. Her name, her education, her career achievements, the constitutional amendments she'd memorized, the legal precedents that had shaped corporate law, the mathematical principles that governed financial analysis. Objective reality existed independently of anyone's attempts to manipulate her perception of it. The breakthrough came when Victoria realized Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed she would break like his previous victims, accepting the narrative of mental illness rather than fighting back with every tool at her disposal. Instead, she'd been sharpened by the pressure, transformed from a victim into a weapon specifically designed to destroy the system that had tried to destroy her. Victoria began actively recruiting other patients with the systematic approach she'd once used to build legal teams for complex corporate cases. Each woman brought specific skills that complemented the others: Margaret's financial expertise, Patricia's law enforcement connections, Jennifer's media relationships, and her own legal knowledge. During group therapy, Victoria caught herself using the same calming breathing techniques she'd employed before major court appearances, the physiological preparation for intellectual combat that her body remembered even after months of chemical suppression. Her professional instincts remained intact beneath the manufactured confusion, ready to emerge when called upon. "You're stronger than you know," she told the other patients, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years winning impossible cases through careful preparation and strategic thinking. "They want you to believe you're sick because your competence threatens their power. But competence isn't a disease. Intelligence isn't a symptom. Professional success isn't a mental illness." The transformation was remarkable. Women who'd been broken by months of systematic psychological abuse began to remember who they'd been before their husbands had tried to erase them. The economist started analyzing hospital financial records. The federal prosecutor began building cases against their captors. The documentary filmmaker gathered evidence through covert filming techniques. Rachel's discovery that Dr. Hayes had been falsifying medical records for dozens of patients suddenly provided the documentary evidence they needed to prove systematic fraud rather than individual medical treatment. The Medicare billing irregularities alone would trigger federal investigations, but combined with the evidence of pharmaceutical manipulation and fraudulent commitments, they had grounds for criminal charges that could bring down the entire network. "We're not just building cases against our individual husbands," Victoria realized during one of their covert meetings. "We're exposing a criminal enterprise that has victimized dozens of women across multiple states. The FBI is going to be very interested in what we've documented." The war was no longer about individual survival. It had become about justice for every woman who'd been silenced, disappeared, or destroyed by powerful men who viewed their wives as obstacles to be eliminated rather than partners to be cherished. And Victoria Sterling, the lawyer who'd been buried under months of systematic abuse, was finally ready to practice law again. Detective Sarah Walsh's investigation accelerated with the precision of a federal task force operation, which was exactly what it had become. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had taken interest in the Pine Ridge case after Sarah's initial reports suggested a pattern of Medicare fraud that extended far beyond simple billing irregularities. Victoria learned about the escalation during what appeared to be a routine psychiatric evaluation, but was actually a covert briefing from undercover federal agents who'd infiltrated the hospital staff. The woman introduced as Nurse Johnson was actually Special Agent Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of white-collar crime investigations who'd spent the past 2 weeks documenting the network of corruption Victoria and her allies had exposed. "We have enough evidence for a federal grand jury," Agent Santos explained while pretending to check Victoria's vital signs. "Bank records, pharmaceutical procurement logs, falsified medical documents, and testimony from multiple witnesses. But we need to move carefully because arresting any individual conspirator too early could alert the others to destroy evidence." The scope of the federal investigation was breathtaking. Marcus Sterling wasn't just under surveillance. He was the center of a web that connected to judicial corruption, medical fraud, and organized crime activities across 6 states. The consulting fees he'd paid to various facilities weren't just bribes. They were investments in a criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars through systematic exploitation of wealthy women. "Your husband made a crucial error," Agent Santos continued, her voice professionally neutral, while her eyes burned with the controlled fury of someone who devoted her career to protecting victims of financial crimes. "He kept detailed records of every transaction, every consultation, every success story where an inconvenient wife was permanently silenced. He thought he was building a business model. Instead, he created a comprehensive confession." Victoria felt a cold satisfaction settle over her as the implications became clear. Marcus's compulsive need to document his achievements, the same trait that had made him successful in legitimate business, had become the instrument of his destruction in criminal enterprise. But the investigation also revealed how much danger they were all in. Marcus, unaware of the federal surveillance, was increasing pressure on Victoria to sign financial documents. His visits became more frequent and more aggressive, driven by desperation as his business empire teetered on the edge of collapse. "You're not improving, darling," he said during a particularly tense visit, his usual smooth charm cracking to reveal something desperate and dangerous underneath. "Dr. Hayes thinks more intensive treatment might be necessary. Perhaps a more secure facility where you can focus on your recovery without distractions." Intensive treatment. More secure facility. Victoria understood the coded threat. If she continued to resist his control, she would disappear into a system where even federal agents might not be able to find her. Victoria's response surprised Marcus and possibly saved her life. Instead of the fear or pleading he expected, she demonstrated calm competence that carried echoes of the lawyer she'd once been. "I understand your concern, Marcus. Perhaps we should discuss this with Dr. Montgomery. She's been very helpful in clarifying my situation and developing treatment goals that address my specific needs." Victoria's deliberately ambiguous words could mean submission to his demands or strategic maneuvering for better position. Marcus couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty created his first moment of genuine doubt about his control over the situation. The ambiguity was intentional, designed to buy time while federal agents completed their evidence collection. Rachel coordinated with the investigation team to document Marcus's next visit through hidden surveillance equipment that would capture him in the act of explicitly threatening his wife and bribing medical personnel. The recorded conversation was devastating. Marcus's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing financial incentives for keeping Victoria permanently institutionalized. Dr. Hayes agreeing to falsify treatment records in exchange for continued donations to the hospital. Explicit discussions of medication protocols designed to ensure patient compliance rather than therapeutic benefit. Evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, attempted murder, and violation of numerous federal healthcare laws. The kind of recordings that would convince juries and judges that what appeared to be legitimate medical treatment was actually systematic criminal enterprise. Victoria's legal mind cataloged every violation with the precision that had once made her one of Manhattan's most effective corporate attorneys. "We have him on multiple felonies," she told Agent Santos during another covert briefing. "The question is timing. If we move too early, he might have resources to escape or destroy evidence. If we wait too long, other women could be hurt. The decision was made for them when Hannah Price's parallel investigation revealed that Marcus had begun targeting other wives of his business associates, using the Pine Ridge model to solve their inconvenient woman problems. 3 new commitments were scheduled for the following month, women whose only crime was knowing too much about their husband's questionable business practices. "We can't wait," Victoria insisted. "Every day we delay means other women are being poisoned, manipulated, and disappeared into this system. The evidence we have is already sufficient for conviction. It's time to act." Victoria spent an evening teaching Patricia Whitmore's teenage daughter legal research techniques during a family visit, ostensibly helping with a school project, but actually passing along sophisticated legal knowledge that might prove useful if the girl ever found herself in similar circumstances. The simple act of education, of sharing knowledge and empowering another young woman, reminded Victoria who she really was beneath Marcus's manufactured narrative of mental illness. She was a teacher, a mentor, a protector of people who couldn't protect themselves. That identity had been buried under months of systematic psychological abuse, but it hadn't been destroyed. If anything, her own experience as a victim had sharpened her understanding of how systems could be used to exploit vulnerable people. Hannah Price coordinated with a team of attorneys building parallel civil cases against every man who'd participated in the conspiracy. Victoria's situation had exposed a network affecting dozens of families across multiple states, creating grounds for class action lawsuits that would bankrupt the perpetrators even if they somehow escaped criminal prosecution. "The financial recovery alone will be unprecedented," Hannah explained during one of their coded conversations. "We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, plus punitive awards that will send a message to anyone thinking about replicating this system." Victoria found herself automatically organizing evidence, the way she'd organized case files during her corporate law career, creating comprehensive dossiers that linked financial records to witness testimony to physical evidence. Some skills become instinct after years of practice, emerging automatically when circumstances demand their use. The psychological evaluation that was supposed to declare Victoria permanently incompetent became her opportunity to demonstrate complete mental clarity in front of federal agents posing as medical observers. Dr. Hayes, unaware of the surveillance, conducted the assessment with the confidence of someone who believed his fraudulent system was unassailable. Victoria's performance was masterful, a combination of legal precision and psychological insight that left no doubt about her intellectual capacity. She answered every question with measured reasoning that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of her financial situation, her legal rights, and her long-term goals. She articulated treatment preferences with the authority of someone who understood exactly what was being done to her and why. Most damning of all, she requested specific medical tests that would reveal the pharmaceutical compounds that had been administered without her knowledge or consent, demonstrating not paranoid delusions, but rational analysis of evidence-based medical concerns. Dr. Hayes realized too late that Victoria had been playing a long game, maintaining the appearance of compliance while systematically building a case against everyone who'd participated in her systematic destruction. The expression on his face when federal agents arrested him during the evaluation became Victoria's first moment of true satisfaction since her commitment. "You think you're so smart," Dr. Hayes snarled as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You have no idea how deep this goes, how many people are involved, how much money is at stake. You're just one woman against an entire system." "Actually," Victoria replied with the calm authority she'd once used to demolish opposing counsel in corporate litigation, "I have extensive documentation of exactly how deep this goes. The FBI has been very thorough in their investigation, and I've been very helpful in providing evidence. You're right about one thing, though. There is an entire system involved. That's why this is going to be a federal case rather than individual prosecutions." The moment felt like stepping back into her own skin after months of being forced to wear someone else's identity. Victoria Sterling, the lawyer, was fully present again, ready to practice the kind of law that protected victims rather than corporate profits. Dr. Hayes was led away in handcuffs while Victoria remained calm and composed, already planning the testimony she would give to federal grand juries and congressional committees. The woman Marcus had tried to destroy had become the architect of his downfall, using every skill he tried to suppress to build a case that would ensure he could never harm another woman. The investigation had become something larger than individual justice. It was a reckoning for every man who believed that women were disposable, that wealth and power gave them the right to erase inconvenient people, that the system would always protect them regardless of their crimes. Victoria looked forward to proving them wrong. Marcus arrived at Pine Ridge on a crisp October morning, expecting to finalize Victoria's permanent commitment and complete the legal framework that would give him unrestricted access to her $300 million trust fund. Instead, federal agents were waiting in the parking lot with arrest warrants that represented 2 years of investigation into the most sophisticated financial fraud conspiracy in recent memory. Victoria watched through Rachel's office window as her billionaire husband was arrested, his hands cuffed behind his back while Agent Santos read him his rights. 20 years of marriage ending not with divorce papers, but with federal criminal charges that could result in life imprisonment. The moment should have felt triumphant, but Victoria discovered that watching Marcus's destruction provided no satisfaction, only a profound sense of relief that the immediate threat to her life had been neutralized. This wasn't revenge she was witnessing, it was justice, methodical and impersonal, and absolutely final. "How do you feel?" Rachel asked, settling into the chair beside Victoria, as they watched Marcus being placed in the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. "Empty," Victoria answered honestly. "I expected to feel angry or vindicated or something, but mostly I just feel tired, like I've been holding my breath for months and can finally exhale." The emotional numbness was probably a form of psychological protection, Rachel explained later. Victoria had endured systematic trauma for so long that her mind needed time to process the fact that the danger was actually over, that she was genuinely safe for the first time in years. The legal proceedings moved with the efficiency that characterized federal white-collar crime prosecutions, when prosecutors had overwhelming evidence. Victoria's meticulous documentation, combined with the federal surveillance operation, created a case so comprehensive that plea bargain negotiations began within 48 hours of Marcus's arrest. But Victoria's emotional journey was far more complex than the legal resolution. The systematic psychological abuse she'd endured had created trauma that wouldn't be resolved by courtroom victories or financial settlements. Rachel guided her through the difficult process of rebuilding her sense of self after months of systematic gaslighting designed to make her question her own sanity. "Trauma doesn't disappear just because the perpetrator is arrested," Rachel explained during one of their therapeutic sessions. "Your mind created survival mechanisms to protect you from psychological destruction. Those mechanisms served you well during the crisis, but they may not serve you as well during recovery." Victoria discovered that freedom felt more frightening than imprisonment had in some ways. At Pine Ridge, her world had been confined but predictable. Now she faced the overwhelming task of rebuilding a life that had been systematically dismantled piece by piece. The panic attacks began during her second week of legal freedom, waves of anxiety that struck without warning and left her gasping for breath in grocery store aisles or restaurant bathrooms. The simple act of making decisions, what to eat, what to wear, where to live, became overwhelming when every choice had been controlled by someone else for so long. "I can't do this," Victoria told Rachel during one particularly difficult session. "I don't remember how to be a person. Marcus didn't just control my actions. He controlled my thoughts, my reactions, my entire sense of reality. Now that he's gone, I don't know who I am anymore." The admission felt like surrender, but Rachel helped her understand it as the beginning of genuine healing. "You're grieving," Rachel explained, "not for Marcus, but for the version of yourself that existed before the abuse began. That person is gone, and you need to mourn her before you can become who you're meant to be now." Victoria testified before a federal grand jury with devastating precision, her legal training allowing her to present evidence that would have broken civilian witnesses. She was no longer just a victim. She had become the prosecutor of her own case, using every skill Marcus had tried to suppress to build the foundation of his legal destruction. "They tried to convince the world I was crazy," Victoria told the prosecutors during her preparation sessions. "Instead, they revealed their own corruption. The evidence speaks for itself." The other women Victoria had helped organize also testified, each adding crucial pieces to the larger picture of systematic abuse disguised as mental health care. Margaret Thornfield's financial expertise exposed the money laundering operations. Patricia Whitmore's law enforcement background revealed the organized crime connections. Jennifer Crawford's documentary evidence provided visual proof of the conspiracy's scope and coordination. Pine Ridge's legitimate patients received proper care, as the facility was restructured under federal oversight, with Rachel Montgomery appointed as interim administrator to ensure that actual therapeutic treatment replaced the systematic abuse that had masqueraded as medical care. Victoria's case became a catalyst for healthcare reform, leading to federal legislation that strengthened protections for psychiatric patients and created oversight mechanisms to prevent similar abuse. Victoria stood in Rachel's office, now the administrator's office, looking out at the same gardens where she'd once felt trapped like an animal in a luxury zoo. The view hadn't changed, but her relationship to it had transformed completely. What had once represented confinement now symbolized the possibility of healing, both for herself and for the other women who'd been victimized by the system. Marcus's tech empire collapsed as the fraud investigation expanded into every aspect of his business operations. His partners distanced themselves with the speed that characterized wealthy people, abandoning associations that might contaminate their own reputations. His mother, Eleanor Sterling, quietly transferred family assets beyond his reach, protecting the Sterling name from complete destruction while abandoning her son to face the consequences of his choices alone. Victoria's trust fund remained intact and protected by her legal maneuvering, but more importantly, she was alive and free to decide how to use both her financial resources and her hard-won knowledge to prevent similar tragedies. The money would become the foundation for her next chapter, but first she needed to figure out who she was beyond the roles of victim and survivor. Victoria found herself unconsciously straightening her posture during media interviews, the way she had before important court appearances during her corporate law career. Her body remembered being powerful, competent, respected, even when her mind struggled to believe those qualities could exist again. The media attention was intense but manageable, primarily because Victoria's legal background prepared her to navigate interviews, congressional testimony, and documentary filmmakers drawn to her story. She understood how to frame narratives, control information flow, and protect her privacy while still advancing the cause of other women who might face similar situations. Marcus's reputation was destroyed not through Victoria's revenge, but through his own documented actions revealed in federal court proceedings. Everyone finally saw who he really was, not a successful businessman concerned about his wife's mental health, but a criminal who'd built an empire on fraud and maintained it through the systematic destruction of women who threatened his continued freedom. The most difficult moment came when Eleanor Sterling requested a private meeting, arriving at Victoria's temporary apartment with the kind of elegant composure that had characterized the Sterling family for 3 generations. What she revealed would reframe everything Victoria thought she knew about her marriage and her husband's capacity for evil. "There's something you need to know about Marcus," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the weight of secrets that had been buried for decades. "Something I should have told you years ago, but I convinced myself that protecting the family name was more important than protecting you." Victoria poured tea with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will, understanding instinctively that whatever Eleanor was about to reveal would be worse than anything she'd already discovered about Marcus's criminal activities. "His first wife, Caroline," Eleanor continued, "she didn't commit suicide the way the newspapers reported. Marcus killed her." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, transforming Victoria's understanding of her own situation from financial fraud and psychological abuse to something far more sinister. She hadn't been Marcus's first victim. She'd been his most carefully planned one, the woman he'd married specifically to perfect techniques that had killed Caroline Sterling 15 years earlier. "Caroline died at Pine Ridge," Eleanor explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "The same room you occupied, the same treatment protocols, the same systematic destruction of her mental state until she couldn't distinguish between reality and the manufactured narrative Marcus had created. But Caroline didn't have allies like you did. She died alone, convinced she was mentally ill, believing that suicide was her only escape from the madness." "Huh." Victoria realized she was never Marcus's first attempt at this particular crime. She was his second, more sophisticated effort to perfect a murder weapon disguised as mental health care. The revelation was devastating not just because of what it revealed about Marcus, but because of what it suggested about how many other women might have died in similar circumstances without anyone recognizing their deaths as murders. The federal investigation expanded to include Caroline's death, with exhumation orders and forensic analysis that would determine whether the same pharmaceutical cocktails Marcus had used on Victoria had also been used to drive his first wife to suicide. The implications were staggering. If the pattern held, they weren't dealing with financial fraud and false imprisonment, but with serial murder conducted through medical systems that were supposed to heal rather than harm. Victoria grieved for Caroline Sterling as if she were mourning her own death, which in many ways she was. She grieved for the woman Caroline had been before Marcus destroyed her, for all the women who died in similar circumstances without anyone recognizing they'd been murdered, for the person Victoria herself had been before systematic abuse had nearly erased her from existence. But she also felt a profound sense of responsibility to ensure that Caroline's death would finally receive justice and that no other woman would face the same fate. The foundation she was planning would be named for Caroline, honoring her memory while protecting future victims from the system that had killed her. The emotional layer of deep vulnerability had revealed itself not as weakness, but as the necessary precondition for transformation. Victoria had been broken down to her essential core, but that core had proved unbreakable. Now she could begin the process of rebuilding herself into someone stronger, more purposeful, and absolutely committed to preventing other women from experiencing the nightmare she'd survived. The exhumation of Caroline Sterling's body took place on a gray November morning, 15 years after her death had been ruled suicide by a coroner who'd never questioned the narrative provided by her grieving widower. Victoria stood in the cemetery, surrounded by federal agents, forensic specialists, and the weight of truth that had been buried along with Caroline's remains. The forensic analysis would take weeks, but Victoria already knew what the results would show. Traces of the same pharmaceutical cocktail Marcus had used to poison her. Evidence of systematic chemical manipulation designed to create the symptoms of mental illness that had justified Caroline's commitment to Pine Ridge. She was an architect, Eleanor Sterling said quietly, standing beside Victoria as they watched the careful excavation process. Brilliant, creative, passionate about sustainable design. She started asking questions about Marcus's business practices, about contracts that didn't make environmental sense, about projects that seemed designed to circumvent EPA regulations rather than comply with them. Victoria could picture Caroline as she must have been, a professional woman who'd used her expertise to challenge her husband's questionable business decisions, not understanding that her competence made her a threat to be eliminated rather than a partner to be consulted. "When did you first suspect?" Victoria asked. "The medication," Eleanor admitted. Caroline had never taken psychiatric drugs in her life, but suddenly she was on multiple prescriptions for conditions that had appeared overnight. She'd call me crying, saying she couldn't think clearly, couldn't remember conversations, couldn't trust her own perceptions. I thought she was having a genuine breakdown from work stress. The pattern was identical to Victoria's experience. Systematic poisoning disguised as treatment for mental illness that had been chemically induced. Marcus had refined his techniques over 15 years, becoming more sophisticated in his methods, but maintaining the same basic approach to eliminating inconvenient women. Rachel helped Victoria process the revelation that her marriage had been built on murder, that every moment of affection Marcus had shown her had been calculated performance designed to establish the relationship he would later use as a weapon. The psychological impact was devastating, requiring careful therapeutic work to prevent Victoria from internalizing blame for not recognizing the danger she'd been in. "You survived because you fought back," Rachel reminded her during their sessions. Caroline didn't have that opportunity. She didn't have allies, didn't have someone who recognized the signs of systematic abuse, didn't have the legal training that allowed you to analyze evidence even while you were being poisoned. Victoria's legal mind began planning Caroline's posthumous justice with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to corporate acquisitions. Wrongful death suits, criminal charges that would be upgraded to murder, public testimony that would honor Caroline's memory while exposing the system that had killed her. The challenge was emotional rather than legal. Victoria had to testify about patterns of behavior that connected Caroline's death to her own systematic poisoning, describing in clinical detail the pharmaceutical manipulation, psychological abuse, and institutional betrayal that had nearly claimed her own life. Her legal training allowed her to present evidence that would have broken a civilian witness, but the personal cost was enormous. "I see Caroline in every woman who arrives at Pine Ridge now," Victoria told Rachel. "I see myself 15 years ago, if I hadn't had allies, if I hadn't fought back, if I'd believed the narrative of mental illness instead of trusting my own perceptions." The discovery of Caroline's murder transformed Marcus's legal situation from white-collar crime to capital charges. His attorney's attempts at plea bargaining were rejected as prosecutors built a death penalty case that would ensure he could never harm another woman. The systematic nature of his crimes, the vulnerable populations he'd targeted, and the sophistication of his methods made him exactly the kind of defendant that capital punishment was designed to address. Victoria testified again, this time about the evolution of Marcus's techniques from his first marriage to his second. Her professional training allowed her to present evidence with devastating clarity, describing the refinements he'd made to his poisoning protocols, his institutional relationships, and his methods of psychological manipulation. During testimony, Victoria used the same methodical evidence presentation style she'd perfected as a corporate lawyer, but now those skills served justice rather than profit. Every technique Marcus had tried to suppress and erase became a weapon against him, proof that his attempts to destroy her competence had not only failed, but had created his most dangerous opponent. Marcus's suicide attempt in federal custody failed, though whether by accident or design remained unclear. He survived with permanent injuries that ensured he would face trial for both women's deaths, unable to escape through death the justice that had finally caught up with his crimes. Victoria felt no sympathy watching him wheeled into court in a wheelchair, his once commanding presence reduced to the pathetic figure of a man who'd built his empire on the suffering of women who trusted him. "He chose to destroy lives," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "Now he faces consequences." "I'm not responsible for his choices," Victoria reminded herself whenever guilt tried to intrude on her sense of justice. "I'm only responsible for surviving them and ensuring no other woman faces what Caroline and I experienced." The media narrative shifted from wealthy wife's mental breakdown to serial killer's pattern exposed by survivor's courage. Victoria's story became a cautionary tale about the intersection of wealth, power, and misogyny, but also an inspiring example of how systematic oppression could be overcome through intelligence, determination, and the courage to trust one's own perceptions despite systematic attempts to destroy that trust. The FBI discovered evidence linking Marcus to suspicious deaths of 3 other women across different states, transforming Victoria's case from an individual crime to the exposure of a serial killer who'd operated for 20 years. Each new revelation validated Victoria's decision to fight back, rather than accept the narrative of mental illness that had killed Caroline and would have killed her. Victoria visited Caroline's grave regularly during the months leading up to Marcus's trial, bringing flowers and speaking aloud about the progress of the case, the other women who'd been saved, and the foundation that would honor Caroline's memory while protecting future victims. The conversations felt like reporting to a colleague, updating her on developments in a case they were working together, despite being separated by death in 15 years. "We got him," Victoria said during her final visit before the trial began. "Not just arrested, but completely exposed. Everyone knows what he really was, what he did to you, what he tried to do to so many others. Your death is finally going to mean something." The simple headstone bore Marcus's chosen epitaph, "Beloved wife who lost her battle with depression." Victoria had successfully petitioned the court to have it changed to reflect the truth. Caroline Elizabeth Sterling, architect and visionary, murdered by the man who claimed to love her. Marcus's trial became a media sensation, but Victoria attended every day not for publicity or personal satisfaction, but out of responsibility to Caroline and the other victims whose voices had been silenced. She testified with clinical precision about the methods Marcus had used, the institutional corruption he'd fostered, and the systematic nature of his crimes against women whose only fault had been trusting the man they'd married. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. 2 murders in the first degree, attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and violation of federal civil rights laws. Marcus Sterling was sentenced to death, though the appeals process would likely extend his punishment for years or decades. Victoria felt closure watching the sentence pronounced, but not celebration. Justice wasn't revenge. It was accountability, the formal recognition that Caroline's death had been murder, and that systematic abuse of women would face legal consequences regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or social position. Walking out of the courthouse after the sentencing, Victoria instinctively checked her reflection in the glass doors and recognized herself completely for the first time since her commitment to Pine Ridge. She saw the lawyer she'd been before Marcus, but stronger, more purposeful, tempered by trauma, into something more resilient than she'd ever imagined possible. Rachel's friendship had become the foundation for Victoria's new life, their law school bond tested by extraordinary circumstances and emerging deeper and more meaningful than either had thought possible. They'd saved each other in different ways. Rachel had provided the medical expertise and institutional access that made Victoria's survival possible, while Victoria had given Rachel the legal framework and evidence collection that transformed individual resistance into systematic reform. "You know what I realized," Victoria said to Rachel as they walked away from the courthouse together. "Marcus thought he was destroying me, but he was actually creating the person I was always meant to become. Not the corporate lawyer who protected profit over people, but someone who understood what it meant to be powerless and was determined to ensure no one else faced that experience alone." Caroline Sterling's death had finally received justice, but more importantly, it had catalyzed changes that would protect other women from similar fates. The foundation Victoria was planning would be Caroline's true memorial, a living testament to the belief that women's lives had value beyond their utility to powerful men. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate was complete. Victoria had found her quiet strength not in spite of what Marcus had done to her, but because of how she'd chosen to respond to his attempts at destruction. She was ready to build something meaningful from the wreckage of her old life. The investigation that began with Victoria Sterling's fraudulent commitment had metastasized into the largest healthcare fraud case in federal history, revealing Marcus Sterling as the architect of a network that spanned 6 states and involved dozens of wealthy men who'd purchased solutions to their inconvenient woman problems through systematically corrupted medical institutions. Victoria became the key witness in congressional hearings that examined fundamental failures in psychiatric care oversight, her composed testimony contrasting sharply with the chaos Marcus had created through his criminal enterprise. She wore the same style of professional suits she'd favored during her corporate law career, but now they represented authentic power rather than Marcus's carefully manufactured image of respectability. "The system failed at every level," Victoria told the Senate Subcommittee on Healthcare Oversight, her voice carrying across the packed hearing room with the authority of someone who'd survived what she was describing. "Judges signed commitment orders without independent verification. Doctors accepted payment for diagnoses they never investigated. Hospital administrators prioritized profit over patient welfare. And women died because no one in authority questioned why so many wealthy wives were suddenly developing convenient mental illnesses." The scope of testimony was breathtaking. Margaret Thornfield presented financial analysis proving systematic embezzlement disguised as medical expenses. Patricia Whitmore detailed organized crime connections that extended into judicial corruption and political bribery. Jennifer Crawford screened documentary footage that showed the coordination between supposedly independent medical facilities across multiple states. Victoria realized during those hearings that she wasn't just surviving her ordeal. She was thriving in ways she'd never imagined possible. The skills Marcus had tried to suppress, analytical thinking, public speaking, strategic planning, had become more powerful through the trauma that was supposed to destroy them. "My experience wasn't meaningless suffering," Victoria told Rachel during one of their evening conversations in what had once been Rachel's office, but was now the administrator's suite at the reformed Pine Ridge facility. It was preparation for meaningful work. The other survivors who contacted Victoria through Hannah Price's law firm created a network that spanned the country. Women from California, Florida, Texas, and beyond, who'd experienced variations of the same systematic abuse. Each had been isolated, poisoned, gaslit, and institutionalized by men who viewed their wives' competence as threats to be eliminated rather than assets to be cherished. Victoria coordinated survivor testimony with the precision she'd once applied to complex corporate litigation, but now her organizational skills served justice rather than profit. Her experience at Pine Ridge had taught her to identify patterns of abuse, recognize institutional manipulation, and build cases that protected vulnerable people from systematic exploitation. The criminal network's exposure led to reforms that extended far beyond psychiatric care. New federal legislation required independent advocacy for all involuntary commitments, established oversight mechanisms for healthcare facilities serving wealthy patients, and created criminal penalties for medical professionals who accepted payment for fraudulent diagnoses. Most importantly, the Caroline Sterling Foundation for Survivor Justice became operational with Victoria as its executive director, funded by her family trust and supported by donations from other women who'd escaped similar situations. The foundation's mission was comprehensive: preventing medical abuse, supporting survivors of psychological manipulation, and educating professionals about the intersection of domestic violence and healthcare fraud. Victoria discovered that losing Marcus wasn't losing anything valuable. She'd gained herself. The identity she'd built around being the billionaire's wife had been artificial, constructed to serve his needs rather than reflecting her authentic self. Without that false identity, she was free to become who she'd always been meant to be, an advocate for people who couldn't protect themselves. The Pine Ridge facility was restructured as a legitimate psychiatric hospital under federal oversight, with Rachel Montgomery as its permanent medical director and a board of directors that included survivors of institutional abuse alongside respected healthcare professionals. What had been a weapon against vulnerable women became a model for ethical psychiatric care. Dr. Hayes received a 20-year federal sentence for his role in the conspiracy, his medical license permanently revoked, and his reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. Thomas Reed lost his law license and faced multiple fraud charges, his legal career ending in disgrace and criminal conviction. But the most satisfying outcome was systematic rather than individual. The exposure of Marcus's network led to investigations in every state, resulting in dozens of arrests and the closure of multiple facilities that had operated similar schemes. Women who'd been trapped in fraudulent commitments were released and provided with legal support to rebuild their lives. Marcus Sterling's trial had become a media sensation that Victoria attended every day, not from personal vendetta, but from professional responsibility to Caroline and the other victims whose voices had been systematically silenced. She testified with devastating effectiveness about the evolution of his criminal methods, the institutional corruption he'd fostered, and the psychological techniques he'd used to break down his victims' resistance. After a particularly difficult day of testimony that had required Victoria to describe in clinical detail the pharmaceutical torture she'd endured, she walked through Central Park and remembered how confined she'd felt in Marcus's world. Freedom had a physical sensation she'd forgotten existed: the ability to make decisions without considering how they would affect someone else's need to control her behavior. The verdict was guilty on all counts: serial murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and civil rights violations. Marcus Sterling received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again pose a threat to vulnerable women. The judge's statement during sentencing explicitly referenced the systematic nature of his crimes and the particular vulnerability of the populations he targeted. Victoria felt profound closure watching the sentence pronounced, but not personal satisfaction. "Justice isn't revenge," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "It's accountability, and it's protection for future victims who won't have to face what Caroline and I experienced." Walking out of the courthouse, Victoria instinctively checked her reflection in the glass doors and saw herself completely. Not the broken woman who'd been committed to Pine Ridge, not the corporate lawyer who'd prioritized profit over principle, but someone entirely new. Someone who'd been forged in trauma but tempered by justice, stronger and more purposeful than she'd ever imagined possible. Rachel's friendship had become the foundation for Victoria's transformation. their professional collaboration anchoring both women's growth into roles they'd never anticipated but were perfectly suited to fill. They'd created something beautiful from systematic ugliness, turning institutional corruption into ethical healthcare and individual suffering into collective advocacy. The letter from Caroline's sister, Dr. Emily Hartwell, arrived on the first anniversary of Marcus's conviction, thanking Victoria for giving Caroline a voice posthumously, but also containing a request that would define Victoria's future work. Emily ran a foundation supporting domestic violence survivors and wanted Victoria's help expanding their mission to include psychological abuse and medical gaslighting. Your story has shown us that domestic violence can take forms we never imagined, Emily wrote. Women are being systematically destroyed through medical systems, legal systems, and financial systems that are supposed to protect them. We need your expertise to help other women recognize these patterns before it's too late. Victoria accepted the collaboration immediately, understanding that her experience provided unique qualifications for protecting other women from systematic manipulation disguised as care or concern. The Caroline Sterling Foundation would work with Emily's organization to create the first comprehensive resource for women facing psychological abuse through institutional systems. The foundation's first major case involved a tech executive whose husband had been systematically undermining her career and mental health through methods that closely paralleled Victoria's experience. The woman had been fired from her position after a series of episodes that were actually reactions to being drugged, and her husband was preparing to have her committed for technology addiction and paranoid delusions about corporate espionage. Victoria recognized the pattern immediately and coordinated with law enforcement to document the husband's pharmaceutical manipulation before it could progress to institutional commitment. The intervention saved the woman's career, freedom, and possibly her life, while adding another conviction to the growing list of men who'd learned that systematic abuse of women now carried serious criminal penalties. The hardest part, Victoria told the woman during their first meeting, is trusting your own perceptions again after someone has systematically tried to convince you that your competence is mental illness. But you're not crazy. You're being targeted, and now you have allies who understand exactly what you're experiencing. Victoria found herself unconsciously using the same confident posture she developed during her corporate law career, but now it served a different purpose: protecting others rather than protecting profits, advocating for vulnerability rather than power, building systems that supported healing rather than exploitation. Hannah Price joined the foundation as legal counsel, bringing her expertise in complex litigation to cases that often required coordination between criminal and civil proceedings. Together, they created precedent-setting legal strategies that strengthened protections for abuse survivors and held institutions accountable for enabling systematic exploitation of vulnerable patients. Eleanor Sterling, freed from her son's toxic influence and the complicity it had required, became an unlikely ally in the Foundation's work. Her family well supported the expansion of survivor services, a form of restorative justice that acknowledged her failure to protect Caroline while ensuring that other women would receive the support Caroline had needed but never found. Victoria's romantic life remained intentionally undefined, though not empty. She'd learned the difference between partnership and ownership, between love and control, between authentic intimacy and systematic manipulation. Any future relationship would be built on equality rather than dependency, trust rather than control, mutual respect rather than power dynamics that benefited one person at the expense of another. The Foundation's work expanded rapidly as more women came forward with similar stories, creating a network of survivor advocates who understood the psychology of institutional abuse because they'd lived through it themselves. Victoria's legal expertise, combined with Rachel's medical knowledge and Emily's understanding of domestic violence patterns, created an organization uniquely qualified to address the intersection of healthcare fraud and systematic abuse. Victoria sat in her new office on the 14th floor of a Manhattan building that housed the Caroline Sterling Foundation for Survivor Justice, watching snow fall through floor-to-ceiling windows that reminded her of Pine Ridge, but now represented choice rather than confinement. 3 years had passed since Marcus's conviction, and the foundation had grown from a personal mission into a national organization that had helped hundreds of women escape systematic abuse disguised as medical care. The final scene circled back to the beginning, Victoria in an office, papers spread before her. But now she was reviewing federal legislation designed to strengthen mental health patient protections rather than discovering her own fraudulent commitment papers. The Caroline Sterling Act, named for Marcus's first victim, would create mandatory safeguards against fraudulent psychiatric commitments and establish criminal penalties for medical professionals who participated in systematic abuse of vulnerable patients. The numbers are remarkable, Margaret Thornfield said, settling into the chair across from Victoria's desk with the quarterly impact report that summarized their work. Margaret had become the foundation's financial director, using her economics expertise to ensure their resources were deployed effectively while building the evidence base that demonstrated systematic patterns of abuse across institutional systems. 237 women provided direct assistance, 46 facilities investigated for fraudulent practices, 12 major criminal prosecutions resulting in convictions, Victoria read, and those are just the cases we know about. The foundation's success had attracted national attention, but Victoria had learned to manage media engagement in ways that advanced their mission rather than simply generating publicity. Her legal background helped her frame complex issues in terms that policymakers could understand and act upon, while her personal experience provided the emotional authenticity that made abstract policy debates immediately relevant to audiences who might otherwise dismiss systematic abuse as rare exceptions rather than widespread problems. Patricia Whitmore had joined the foundation as Director of Law Enforcement Relations, using her federal prosecutor background to coordinate with agencies investigating institutional corruption. Her network of contacts in the Bureau had proven invaluable in identifying patterns that might not be visible to individual field offices working isolated cases. The Justice Department wants to expand the task force, Patricia reported during their weekly strategy meeting. They're seeing similar patterns in elder care facilities, immigration detention centers, and even some boarding schools. The methods Marcus pioneered are being adapted for different vulnerable populations. Victoria understood that their work had revealed something larger than individual criminal cases or even healthcare fraud. They'd exposed systematic approaches to neutralizing inconvenient people through institutional systems that were supposed to protect rather than exploit vulnerable populations. The techniques could be adapted for any situation where powerful people needed to eliminate threats while maintaining plausible legal and medical justification. Jennifer Crawford's documentary about the network had won several awards and sparked congressional hearings that led to comprehensive reforms in psychiatric care oversight. But more importantly, it had educated millions of people about warning signs of systematic abuse, creating a more informed public that was less likely to accept official narratives when they contradicted obvious patterns of exploitation. Education is prevention, Jennifer explained during the Foundation's annual board meeting. Every woman who recognizes gaslighting techniques is a woman who can't be manipulated into questioning her own sanity. Every family member who understands psychiatric commitment procedures is someone who can advocate effectively when their loved ones face institutional abuse. The Foundation's first major case after Victoria's recovery had involved a tech executive whose husband had been systematically undermining her career and mental health through pharmaceutical manipulation that closely paralleled Marcus's techniques. The intervention had prevented another fraudulent commitment while providing law enforcement with evidence that led to criminal prosecution and conviction. That success established the Foundation's methodology: early identification of systematic abuse patterns, coordinated intervention involving legal and medical professionals, comprehensive support for survivors during recovery, and strategic litigation that created precedents protecting other vulnerable people from similar exploitation. The hardest part for most survivors, Victoria told new clients during intake interviews, is trusting your own perceptions again after someone has systematically convinced you that your competence is evidence of mental illness. But you're not crazy. You're being targeted by someone who views your abilities as threats rather than assets. Victoria found herself using the same confident posture and authoritative voice she'd developed during her corporate law career. But now those professional skills serve protection rather than profit, advocacy rather than acquisition, healing rather than exploitation. The transformation felt authentic in ways her previous career never had, as if she'd finally found work that aligned her abilities with her values. Hannah Price's legal expertise had proven crucial in developing litigation strategies that addressed the complex intersection of criminal law, civil rights, healthcare regulation, and domestic violence. Their precedent-setting cases had established new legal frameworks for prosecuting systematic abuse while protecting survivors from retaliation and secondary victimization through court processes. "We're changing the legal landscape," Hannah observed. "5 years ago, systematic psychological abuse through medical institutions wasn't recognized as a distinct category of domestic violence. Now it's established federal case law with specific evidentiary standards and criminal penalties." Eleanor Sterling's financial support had enabled the foundation's rapid expansion, but her personal transformation had been equally remarkable. The woman who'd once protected her son's reputation, despite suspecting his involvement in Caroline's death, had become a fierce advocate for transparency and accountability in cases involving systematic abuse of women by wealthy men. "I failed Caroline because I prioritized family reputation over her safety," Eleanor admitted during a foundation fundraising event. "I can't undo that failure, but I can ensure that other women receive the protection Caroline needed and deserved." The foundation's residential program provided temporary housing for women escaping systematic abuse, but more importantly, it offered comprehensive support services that addressed the unique challenges faced by survivors of institutional manipulation. Medical professionals helped patients recover from pharmaceutical abuse. Therapists specialized in treating trauma caused by systematic gaslighting. Legal advocates helped survivors navigate complex proceedings while rebuilding their financial independence. Victoria's romantic life had remained intentionally solitary during the foundation's early years, though she'd developed meaningful friendships with colleagues and survivors who shared understanding of systematic abuse and recovery. She'd learned to distinguish between healthy independence and trauma-based isolation, choosing solitude that supported her healing rather than avoiding intimacy from fear of future manipulation. "I'm not opposed to partnership," Victoria told Rachel during one of their regular dinners, "but any relationship I enter will be built on equality rather than dependency, mutual respect rather than power dynamics, authentic intimacy rather than systematic control." Rachel had become not just Victoria's closest friend, but her most trusted collaborator. Their law school bond deepened by shared experience of institutional corruption and transformed by their joint commitment to ethical healthcare and survivor advocacy. Rachel's position as medical director of the reformed Pine Ridge facility provided crucial insights into systematic patterns of abuse while demonstrating that institutions could be reformed rather than simply closed. The foundation's expansion had attracted interest from international organizations dealing with similar patterns of systematic abuse disguised as medical or legal proceedings. Victoria had testified before United Nations committees examining institutional violence against women, helping establish global frameworks for recognizing and preventing systematic abuse through healthcare systems. "This isn't just an American problem," Victoria explained to delegates from 12 countries during a conference on institutional abuse. "Systematic oppression of women through medical and legal systems exists wherever powerful men have access to corrupted institutions, and vulnerable women lack adequate advocacy and protection." The Caroline Sterling Foundation had become a model for survivor-led organizations that combined direct service provision with systematic advocacy for legal and policy reforms. Victoria's leadership style emphasized collaborative decision-making and shared power rather than hierarchical authority, creating an organizational culture that reflected their values of equality and mutual respect. Victoria checked her phone as the foundation's staff meeting concluded, scrolling through dozens of messages from women seeking help, colleagues coordinating cases, Rachel confirming dinner plans, and board members preparing for the next quarterly meeting. The device that had once shown her isolation now connected her to purposeful relationships and meaningful work that extended her impact far beyond what she could accomplish individually. The story ended with Victoria preparing for another congressional hearing, this time as an expert witness rather than a victim. She wore a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without aggression, her appearance professional and confident rather than defensive or apologetic. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate to expert was complete, but more importantly, it was authentic. Victoria walked toward the hearing room thinking about the journey that had brought her from Marcus's fraudulent commitment papers to federal legislation bearing Caroline's name. The woman who signed those commitment papers died at Pine Ridge, she reflected. The woman who walks free today was born there too. But the birth hadn't been easy or simple. It had required surviving systematic psychological torture, recognizing manipulation despite chemical interference with her perceptions, building alliances with other survivors, coordinating with law enforcement despite institutional corruption, testifying repeatedly about traumatic experiences, and ultimately choosing to transform personal suffering into systematic advocacy for other vulnerable women. Victoria had become exactly who she was meant to be, not despite her experience with Marcus, but because of how she'd chosen to respond to his attempts at destruction. Her legal skills were sharper, her understanding of systematic oppression was deeper, her commitment to justice was more personal, and her ability to protect vulnerable people was more comprehensive than anything she could have achieved without surviving institutional abuse herself. The hearing room filled with congressional staff, media representatives, and advocates who'd come to support the Caroline Sterling Act's passage into federal law. Victoria took her place at the witness table, reviewed her prepared testimony one final time, and looked up to see Rachel in the gallery, smiling with the pride of someone who'd watched her closest friend transform trauma into triumph. The Caroline Sterling Act represents more than legislative reform, Victoria began when called to testify. It represents our collective commitment to ensuring that no woman will ever again face the choice between accepting systematic abuse or fighting back alone. It establishes the principle that institutional authority cannot be used as a weapon against vulnerable people, and that systematic oppression disguised as medical care is a crime that will face serious legal consequences. Victoria had found her voice, her power, and her purpose. The foundation bearing Caroline's name would continue growing, protecting other women from the systematic destruction that had killed Caroline and nearly destroyed Victoria herself. The legislation would prevent future institutional abuse while providing resources for survivors who'd escaped similar situations. Most importantly, Victoria had proven that systematic oppression could be not just survived, but transformed into systematic justice. The network Marcus had created to silence inconvenient women had become the evidence that empowered other women to speak truth to power, hold institutions accountable for systematic abuse, and build alternative systems that prioritized healing over exploitation. The woman who'd once been trapped in a luxury prison had become an architect of freedom for others facing similar imprisonment. The transformation was complete, authentic, and permanent. Victoria Sterling had reclaimed not just her life, but her power to protect other lives from systematic destruction. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation, protection, and the careful construction of systems that served vulnerable people rather than exploiting them. And sometimes the most powerful transformation came from refusing to let someone else's darkness extinguish your own light, no matter how sophisticated their attempts at destruction might be. Victoria Sterling's story didn't end with Marcus's conviction. It began there. The Caroline Sterling Foundation continues to help women escape systematic abuse disguised as medical care. Every month, they prevent new victims from disappearing into fraudulent commitments. But stories like this only reach the women who need them most when they're shared widely. If Victoria's journey resonated with you, if you recognize these patterns in your own life or someone else's, please hit that like button to help this story find other women who might need to hear it. Share this with someone who believes in the power of women supporting women. Leave a comment if you've experienced gaslighting or systematic manipulation. Your story matters, and your voice can help others recognize they're not alone. And subscribe to our channel for more stories about women who refuse to disappear quietly, who transform their survival into advocacy, who prove that systematic oppression can be overcome through intelligence, determination, and the courage to trust your own perceptions. Remember, you're not crazy for noticing patterns. You're not paranoid for questioning inconsistencies. You're not mentally ill because your competence threatens someone else's control. Trust what you see, trust what you feel, and never let anyone convince you that your strength is a symptom. Thank you for listening to Victoria's story. Thank you for believing survivors. And thank you for being part of a community that refuses to let women disappear without a fight.